Hey, what's up, Wire family? Welcome back to another message in our series called Big Picture. So glad you guys are joining us today. Let's jump right into it. So, we're in the last week of our series on a guy in the Bible named Joseph, and it's called Big Picture. The reason it's called Big Picture is because Joseph had a lot of wild and weird and unbelievable things happen to him, both good and bad. But all along, God was working towards this bigger picture in his life, the bigger picture that Joseph just couldn't see at the time. Now, before we get to the last part of Joseph's story today, I want to ask you guys kind of a big question. Ready? Here we go. Have you ever tried to get a little payback on somebody else? Think about this for a minute. Maybe it was a younger sibling who stole your favorite sweater without asking. Or it was a friend who spread a rumor about you. Or maybe it's that guy in small group who always plays pranks on you. I know that I've definitely wanted to get payback on different people throughout different seasons of my life. And the truth is, in big or small ways, I think we've all been wronged. We've all been hurt. We've all been frustrated. We've all had someone do something to us or say something about us or treat us in a way that just makes us want one thing and one thing only. Payback, right? We want the other person to experience the same amount of pain or frustration or embarrassment that we experienced because of them. And here's the thing. We all have the power to pay back. See, not only do we have the potential to want to pay back, but we actually have the power to do it. Sometimes that payback is public. We do something directly and openly to the person who wronged us. Maybe that's confronting them with a big fight or tagging them in a nasty post on social media, or maybe just doing something to embarrass them in front of someone else. That kind of payback isn't hard to recognize because it's out there for the entire world to see. And that's the way that we want it to be, right? We want people to feel that pain. Now, sometimes the payback is a little more passive, meaning it's a little less obvious and maybe a little bit more behind the other person's back. Maybe that's just spreading a rumor about them when they're not around, or maybe you just roll your eyes after they walk away. See, though the other person may not really recognize it or feel the consequence of it right away, you're still getting the payback that you're looking for, kind of in a more subtle way. Or maybe for you, the payback is just in your head, right? You haven't taken a step to actually do something yet to have kind of payback, either publicly or passively, but maybe you just think about it all the time. You're constantly setting up scenarios in your mind of how you'd get the payback you want. And even though you may not actually take the steps to make it happen, it still consumes you. Now, listen, I know this all sounds kind of harsh, but we're all friends here, right? So let's just kind of be honest with each other for a minute and admit that I think we've all felt that way a time or two. There's just something about payback that feels fair to us, isn't it? But just because payback feels fair, it doesn't mean that it is fair. It doesn't mean that it's what's best for us. In fact, I think there's a way better approach that we could take if we put down our power to pay back other people. Now, if there was ever a guy, anyone who had a reason for wanting payback, it was our friend Joseph. His story is full of people betraying him, lying about him, causing him years and pain of suffering that he just simply didn't deserve. To kind of give you a quick recap, Joseph was one of a dozen sons, but his father Jacob loved him the most. Talk about really awkward family dynamics. And because of that, his brothers got so mad that they threw him in a well and eventually sold him into slavery, where he ended up in Egypt. And then when he was actually doing a good job, enough to job where he was working to get a promotion in the house of this guy named Potiphar, Potiphar's wife made a move on Joseph. Well, Joseph turned her down, so she got mad and made up a lie to get him thrown into prison. And there he stayed for several years before finally getting released and promoted to work for the Pharaoh. He became second in command. So it's a lot. And if I put myself in Joseph's sandals for a minute, I can tell you what I'd be thinking about during all those years of slavery and separation from my family and imprisonment. I'd probably be thinking a little less about everybody else, and I'd probably be thinking about how I'm going to get payback for everybody who wronged me, right? I mean, wouldn't that be something that you would be thinking through? So I want to kind of pick up back where we left Joseph's story off and find out exactly what he did. Because at this point, Joseph was doing much better. He had not only been released from prison, but he had been elevated to second in command over all of Egypt. Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of the distribution of food throughout the entire Egyptian empire. And that was a big deal because this was during a period of intense famine in the land. The famine, or shortage of food, was so bad that people from far away started making their journey to Egypt just to find food so they wouldn't starve. And Joseph was the guy that they were coming to for help. Now, of all the people in the world, guess who showed up one day to ask Joseph for food? None other than his very own brothers, the very same guys who sold him into slavery years ago. I mean, what are the chances of that? And while Joseph immediately recognized his brothers, they didn't realize who they were speaking with. It had been so long since they had seen their brother. In fact, they probably assumed that he was dead. And if they didn't, they certainly didn't imagine that the brother that they turned into a slave would be a man with so much power in Egypt. And so they just didn't think that was him. And yet there Joseph stood in a position of complete power before his brothers. They all needed his help. They all needed him to save their lives. And in that moment, he had the power to pay back all the wrongs that they'd committed against him. I mean, this was the moment that Joseph could have been dreaming of, the moment when payback would finally be his. But I want you to take a look at what happened next because it's extraordinary. Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, "Out, all of you." So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. And then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to the Pharaoh's palace. "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. "Please come closer," he said to them. So they came closer. And he said again, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place, because it was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. You can live in the region of Goshen, where you can be near me with all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds and everything you own. I will take care of you there, for there are still 5 years of famine ahead of us. Otherwise, you, your household, and all your animals will starve." Genesis 45, 1-5 and 10-11. So Joseph could have finally done literally anything that he wanted to his brothers. He could have paid them back times 1,000,000 for what they had done to him. He could have left them to starve, or snapped his fingers and had them thrown in prison, or even killed. That's how much power he had to pay them back. But instead, Joseph took a different path. He chose forgiveness. I mean, how amazing is that? Can you imagine how surprised Joseph's brothers must have been? I mean, one minute they found out that their brother Joseph was alive, and then in the next, he was embracing them rather than giving them what they deserved. It's extraordinary. And so here's what I think that we can learn from this part of Joseph's story, because it's a powerful story. And this is it. When you can't see the bigger picture, choose to forgive. You see, Joseph's response to his brothers gives us a powerful example of how God wants us all to deal with the people who wrong us. We may never know what they did or why they did what they did. They may never apologize for the hurt or embarrassment that they caused us. And there are details of the bigger picture that we may never understand, but we still have a choice: forgiveness or payback. We have the power to choose. Think of it this way. If you're in a relationship with another person, a parent, a friend, a sibling, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, anyone, there's something that connects the two of you. There's a bridge. But when someone wrongs or hurts you, that bridge is suddenly broken. It becomes shaky, and the connection between the two of you is damaged. And then you're kind of left with a choice. You can either burn the bridge, breaking it down completely by paying back wrong for the wrong or hurt for your hurt, or you can build the bridge, reestablishing your connection with things like forgiveness and grace and peace. Now, of course, I'm not saying that you just keep rebuilding bridges with people who have hurt you deeply and repeatedly. Sometimes the best way to actually choose forgiveness is to set some healthy boundaries or talk about the wrongs done to you with someone who can actually help, maybe your small group leader or a great counselor or therapist. But when it's possible, it's our job to lay down our right to pay back and instead choose forgiveness. You see, Joseph, he could have made the choice to prove a point. He could have fought to be right. He could have chosen not to help his brothers and burn the bridge between them. But instead, he chose to forgive them. And that changed everything. When you can't see the bigger picture, choose to forgive. Now, I'm sure some of you are hearing this and thinking, yeah, that sounds nice, Daniel, but how can someone actually do that? I mean, how do you choose forgiveness instead of choosing payback? Well, that's a really fair question, because honestly, this is really hard stuff. It's hard to choose to be a bridge builder rather than a bridge burner. And what can make it even harder is when we can't see the bigger picture. We don't know all the details or the full story about the situation that we're in. So how do we even start? Well, first of all, just start small. Practice extending things like grace and forgiveness and peace to others in small ways. When your friend teases you and hurts your feelings, or when your sibling eats that last piece of cake that you'd been saving, or when your parents snap at something that wasn't your fault. Practice choosing forgiveness rather than responding with payback, because the more you do this in small, everyday things, the easier it will be to do it when the bigger things come your way. And the second thing is forgive first. I mean, think about your own life for a second. Who has wronged you recently? You don't need to wait for them to apologize to forgive. You don't need to wait for them to make the first move and say sorry for what they've done to you. The beauty of forgiveness is that you can do it on your own right now. You can make a move to forgive first so that you can finally move on. And number 3 is pursue forgiveness. We can't always control the way people treat us, but we can control the way we treat them in response. And we can pursue forgiveness. What would it look like for you to forgive someone who has wronged you or hurt you this week? Maybe it's just an outward step like starting a conversation or inviting them to sit with you or come over to your house or unlocking them on social media. Or maybe it's just more of an inward step, a prayer you pray or a choice you make to not say rude things or a conversation with your small group leader to help you. Whatever it is, I just want you to take one step this week to pursue forgiveness rather than payback in all of your relationships. Now, of course, forgiveness is not always easy. But the good news is we have a God who is the best at forgiving. He's forgiven each and every one of us, and He wants to help us do the same for other people. And when we ask for His help for forgiving someone, He will always give it to us. So today, maybe that's where you need to start. Ask God to help you forgive someone who has wronged you so you can start building a bridge towards forgiveness rather than payback. And please remember, when you can't see the bigger picture, choose to forgive. See, Joseph's story is pretty crazy, right? I mean, he was part of a family in a conflict. He was tossed into a well and sold into slavery by his own brothers. He fought off repeated invitations to have an affair with his boss's wife, and he was thrown into prison for something that he didn't even do. And even though he went through all of those crazy experiences in his life, Joseph eventually gained enough power to help and even forgive the family who got him into this mess in the first place. In the middle of all this stuff that Joseph couldn't see, the bigger picture that we see today, the way that God was working in his life, he just had to keep trusting and believing and making the next right choice to do what he thought was best. And eventually, years later, it all made sense. Things were made right, and he finally saw the bigger picture that God was working in his life. And I think the same can be true in your life and in my life. So as we close our conversation today about Joseph and how he forgave his brothers, I just want you to think about this one question. What is the hardest thing about choosing forgiveness? Maybe you guys can talk through that as you connect with your small group this weekend. And if you haven't done that, if you're not connecting with your small group, please let us know. We'll help you get connected. And we'll see you in person in a few weeks. We're excited to get back together. We love you guys so much. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next week.